The scent struck Albert hard, catching him off guard. Lavender. Sweet, overwhelming, and completely out of place in their home. He despised it for years, and Rebecca knew that. Yet there it was, clinging to her coat as she walked in. Her face lit up with an unusual brightness. "You're late," Albert said, his tone stiff as he gestured to the clock. "Work ran long," Rebecca replied casually, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She hung her coat on the rack and made her way to the kitchen, her heels tapping on the hardwood floor. Each step seemed to drill into Albert's nerves, a steady reminder of how distant she'd become. It wasn't just the lavender. It was how her phone was constantly in her hand, but always face down on the counter. It was the way she laughed, really laughed, but only at messages, never during their conversations. It was how she vanished into their bedroom for long stretches, only to reappear looking flawless, like she was dressing up for someone else entirely. "Big presentation tonight?" Albert asked, watching as she poured herself a glass of wine. Rebecca paused, her grip tightening around the stem of the glass. "Yeah, clients expect a polished look," she replied, her voice edged with irritation. Albert didn't answer. He nodded, swallowing back the words he wanted to say. They worked in software. What kind of client cared about lipstick and high heels during a late-night meeting? Still, he didn't push, not yet. The next morning, the lavender smell still lingered, a subtle reminder that wouldn't leave Albert's thoughts. Sitting at the breakfast table, he watched as Rebecca breezed through the kitchen, her phone glued to her hand. She barely acknowledged him or their kids, Elton and Lily, as they clamored for her attention. "Mom, can you come to my recital next week?" Elton asked, his voice hopeful. Rebecca hesitated, just for a moment, before forcing a smile. "We'll see, sweetie. Mommy's really busy at work right now." Albert caught the flicker of disappointment in Elton's face. "I'll be there, buddy," Albert said, ruffling his son's hair. "Thanks, Dad," Elton said, his face lighting up. Rebecca shot Albert a sharp look, one that said his simple promise felt like a betrayal. He met her glare head-on, refusing to back down. As Rebecca left for work, Albert's gaze fell on the coat rack. Her coat, the one she'd worn the night before, still hung there, carrying the faint trace of lavender. Acting on impulse, he reached into the pocket and pulled out a folded receipt. It was from a nearby cafe, not her usual spot, but a trendy one they rarely went to. The timestamp read 9:15 p.m., smack in the middle of her supposed late-night meeting. Albert's chest tightened as a flood of questions consumed him. Who had she been meeting? Why was she lying? In the days that followed, the signs became impossible to ignore. Rebecca's phone never left her side. Her laughter, the kind Albert once cherished, came alive only when she was glued to her texts. Her explanations felt increasingly thin. "Big client dinner," she said one evening, slipping into a sleek black dress that clung to her figure. "Do software clients care about designer dresses now?" Albert asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Rebecca froze in the doorway, her face hardening. "You don't understand, Albert. You've never understood what it takes to succeed in my world." Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving behind the scent of her perfume and a gnawing unease in Albert's chest. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. If Rebecca wouldn't tell him the truth, he'd find it himself. Starting small, Albert combed through her credit card statements and dug into old phone bills. That's when he saw it. A string of charges to a hotel just outside of town. Always on the nights she said she was working late. His heart raced as he stared at the screen, his fears solidifying into undeniable evidence. The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture Albert wished he could unsee. Betrayal. That Saturday, Rebecca casually announced she was meeting her sister for brunch. Albert swallowed the bitter laugh that threatened to escape. Her sister had been out of town for weeks. Rebecca had mentioned it herself just a few days earlier. "Which place are you meeting her at?" Albert asked, keeping his tone light. "The Green Fig," Rebecca answered without missing a beat. Albert forced a smile. "Sounds nice. Tell her I said hi." The moment she left, Albert grabbed his keys and followed her. His heart sank as her car pulled into the parking lot of a plain, out-of-the-way motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where people came to stay anonymous. Albert's stomach twisted as he watched Rebecca step out of her car, glancing nervously around before disappearing inside. For 20 minutes, Albert sat in his car, torn between storming in to confront her and driving away to keep his sanity intact. Eventually, he made his choice. Inside the motel lobby, his gaze landed immediately on a lavender scarf draped over the back of a chair. It was unmistakable. He had bought it for Rebecca years ago on a trip she'd begged him to take, a time when he believed their marriage was unbreakable. The memory cut like a knife, the scarf now a cruel symbol of what they'd lost. The receptionist barely looked up when Albert approached the desk. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice dull and uninterested. "Yes," Albert replied, his tone firmer than he expected. "I'm meeting someone. Rebecca Blomfield. Which room is she in?" The man frowned. "Sorry, sir. We can't give out that information." Albert's jaw tightened. "I'm her husband," he said, trying to keep his frustration in check. "She's meeting someone here. I need to know where." The receptionist hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, before shaking his head. "I can't help you, man." Defeated but determined, Albert returned to his car and parked where he had a clear view of the entrance. Another 20 minutes passed before Rebecca reappeared. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair slightly tousled. She wasn't alone. A tall, dark-haired man followed close behind, exuding a confidence that made Albert's blood boil. They didn't touch, but the space between them felt charged, far too intimate. Albert gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Every instinct screamed at him to confront them then and there, but he forced himself to stay calm. Impulsiveness wouldn't help. Instead, he pulled out his phone and snapped a photo. It wasn't perfect, grainy and a bit blurry, but it was enough. Enough to confirm his suspicions. Enough to feed the anger simmering inside him. That evening, Albert said nothing. When Rebecca came home, she acted as if everything was normal, greeting the kids with exaggerated cheer and casually recounting her brunch with her sister. Albert watched her closely, his silence unnerving her. "You're quiet tonight," Rebecca said, pouring herself a glass of wine. "Long day," Albert replied, keeping his voice neutral. Her eyes narrowed, studying him, but he gave nothing away. His fury remained hidden beneath a calm mask. When Rebecca went to bed, Albert stayed up, combing through her social media accounts, cross-referencing details, and finding even more holes in her stories. He wasn't just gathering evidence, he was preparing for the battle ahead. The next week, Albert reached out to his brother Ben. Ben was the type who thrived in chaos, a straight-shooting, no-nonsense guy who had no problem taking the hard road. They met in Ben's cluttered garage, the smell of grease and motor oil thick in the air. "I need your help," Albert said, his voice low. Ben raised an eyebrow. "What kind of help?" Albert hesitated, then pulled out his phone and showed Ben the photo. Ben let out a slow whistle, his expression darkening. "That's her, huh?" Albert nodded. Ben leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "So, what's the plan? You just gonna sit on this, or are you gonna make her pay?" "I'm not rushing into anything," Albert said. "I need to know more. Who this guy is, how long it's been going on. I want to hit her where it hurts." A smirk tugged at Ben's lips. "Finally growing a spine, little brother." "I'm proud of you," Ben had said. With his brother's help, Albert took the next step. They installed a small GPS tracker on Rebecca's car, giving Albert a clear record of her movements. The pattern was undeniable. The same motel, the same times, the same excuses. Each discovery deepened Albert's sense of betrayal, but he didn't confront her. Not yet. He chose to wait, letting her lies pile up until there was no way out. One night, as Albert pored over Rebecca's phone records, a new thought struck him. The man. Did Justin Flanagan, the man Rebecca was meeting, have someone waiting for him at home? Using the number from Rebecca's call logs, Albert found Justin's name. A quick search on social media revealed everything he needed. Justin was married with 2 kids. Albert stared at the screen, his anger mixed with a strange solidarity. If Justin's wife didn't know, she deserved the truth, just like Albert had. The next day, Albert knocked on the door of a modest suburban home. A woman in her early 30s answered, a toddler balanced on her hip. She looked cautious as she spoke. "Can I help you?" My name's Albert Blomfield, he said, his voice calm but steady. I believe my wife is having an affair with your husband. Her eyes widened, and her face turned pale. What? I'm sorry, Albert said, holding up his phone, but I have proof. Can I come in? The woman, Rachel Flanagan, let him in, her expression a mix of shock and heartbreak. They sat in her living room, her toddler clinging to her as she settled on the couch. Show me, she said, her voice shaking. Albert handed her his phone, the photo of Rebecca and Justin outside the motel filling the screen. Rachel stared at it, her face frozen before she spoke in a broken whisper. I knew something wasn't right. He's been working late, traveling more. But I didn't think. Her voice trailed off as she gripped the edge of the couch. Albert nodded, his voice low. I didn't want to believe it either. But it's the same motel, every time. Rachel wiped at her eyes, and her expression shifted from despair to anger. He acts like the perfect husband. But now I know the truth. They sat in heavy silence before Rachel straightened, determination blazing in her eyes. What are you going to do? Albert hesitated. I'm not sure yet, but I'm not letting her get away with this. Then let me help, Rachel said firmly. If we're both in this, we might as well fight back together. Over the next week, Albert and Rachel teamed up. Fueled by her own sense of betrayal, Rachel became an invaluable ally. She dug into Justin's phone records, uncovering explicit messages between him and Rebecca that left no doubt about the affair. Look at this, Rachel said, sliding her laptop toward Albert. The messages laid it all bare. Plans to meet, shared complaints about their spouses, and even moments of mocking disdain. Albert's jaw clenched as he read, the words like fresh cuts to an already deep wound. But he kept his focus. We need to time this right, Albert said. A simple confrontation isn't enough. They need to face real consequences. Rachel nodded. What's the plan? Expose them, Albert said. To everyone. Their families, their friends, their coworkers. And we make sure this sticks in court. The two began laying out a strategy, carefully planning how and when to confront Rebecca and Justin. They agreed it had to be public, somewhere neither could deny or run from. The perfect opportunity came on a sunny Saturday. Rebecca had told Albert she was running errands, but the GPS tracker told a different story. She was meeting Justin at a park, a casual attempt to keep their affair discreet. Albert and Rachel arrived separately, positioning themselves so they wouldn't be seen. From a distance, they watched as Rebecca and Justin sat on a bench, laughing and leaning into each other like teenagers. Albert's chest tightened with anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. Let's do this, he said to Rachel, his voice low but steady. Together, they stepped forward, ready to bring their carefully laid plan to life. As Albert approached the bench, Rebecca's face turned ashen, her expression frozen in shock. Justin, sitting beside her, looked equally panicked as Rachel stepped up behind Albert, her presence adding weight to the confrontation. What's going on? Rebecca's voice trembled, barely audible. You tell me, Albert said coldly. Or better yet, why don't you explain to Rachel what you've been doing with her husband? Rebecca's wide eyes darted to Justin, silently pleading for support, but he was just as stunned as she was. This isn't what it looks like, Rebecca stammered, her voice shaky. Albert raised a hand to stop her. Don't insult me by pretending there's an innocent explanation. Rachel stepped forward, her phone raised. I've seen the messages, Justin. Don't bother denying it. Justin opened his mouth, but seemed unable to speak. His face drained of color as Rachel's anger cut through the silence. You lied to me, she said, her voice sharp with fury. To me, to our kids, to everyone who trusted you. You're nothing but a coward. Rebecca turned to Albert, desperation etched into her face. Please, can we talk about this? She pleaded. We'll talk, Albert said firmly, his tone icy. In court. After the confrontation, Rebecca and Justin scrambled to regain control, but Albert and Rachel had already moved ahead. The evidence Albert had gathered became the cornerstone of his plan to protect his children and ensure Rebecca faced the consequences of her actions. Meeting with his lawyer, Mark, Albert presented the files he had meticulously compiled. This is solid, Mark said as she reviewed the documents. With this, you'll have a strong argument for custody, especially if we can show Rebecca's neglect as a parent. Rachel, meanwhile, filed for divorce, citing infidelity and emotional cruelty. Justin won't know what hit him, she said with steely determination. Rebecca, realizing her lies were unraveling, tried every tactic to regain control. Her messages swung between tearful apologies and seething threats. "You're ruining our family," she wrote in one. "This is all your fault," said another. Albert ignored her, focusing on Elton and Lily. His children were his priority, and he wouldn't let Rebecca's manipulations pull them into the chaos. But Rebecca wasn't done. She filed for joint custody, accusing Albert of alienating the kids from her. The courtroom battle that followed was the ultimate test of Albert's resolve. The courthouse loomed large, its imposing facade a reminder of the battle ahead. Albert adjusted his tie and took a deep breath as Mark walked beside him. "You're ready for this," she said confidently. "We have the evidence, and Rebecca's actions speak for themselves. Stay calm, and let me handle the heavy lifting." Inside the courtroom, Rebecca sat across from Albert, her appearance carefully curated to project innocence. Her lawyer, Frank, was a seasoned litigator with a commanding presence. He opened with a polished argument. "My client, Rebecca Blomfield, is a devoted mother who has been unfairly denied access to her children," Frank declared smoothly. "This case is about restoring her rightful place in their lives." Albert bit his tongue, remembering Mark's advice to remain composed. When Mark took the floor, her calm, precise demeanor immediately commanded attention. "Your Honor," she began, "this case is not about a mother being wrongfully denied access to her children. It's about a parent who has repeatedly placed her personal desires above her responsibilities." Mark presented the evidence with unflinching clarity: the motel receipts, credit card statements for extravagant personal purchases, and phone records exposing Rebecca's affair. These actions, Mark concluded, demonstrate a pattern of neglect. "My client, Albert Blomfield, has provided a stable and nurturing environment for Elton and Lily. He is the parent best equipped to continue doing so." Rachel took the stand next, her testimony a turning point. She recounted Rebecca and Justin's affair with measured precision, detailing how their lies had upended not just their marriages, but also their families. "They didn't just betray us," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "They lied to their children and neglected their responsibilities. Albert deserves to protect his kids from that kind of chaos." Frank objected multiple times, but Rachel's calm, resolute testimony left a lasting impression on the court. As the evidence mounted against her, Rebecca's carefully crafted composure began to crumble. She glared at Albert across the room, her frustration evident in every clenched fist and whispered exchange with her lawyer. When it was her turn to testify, she played the role of the heartbroken mother. "I've made mistakes," Rebecca said, tears streaming down her face. "But that doesn't mean I don't love my children. They need their mother." Her performance was convincing, but the weight of the evidence against her was hard to ignore. As the proceedings neared their conclusion, Albert felt the weight of the moment. He had done everything he could to protect his children and expose the truth. Now, it was up to the court to decide. Mark didn't waste a second dismantling Rebecca's claims. She systematically exposed the holes in her story and directed the court's attention to the undeniable evidence of her neglect and deceit. After hours of testimony, arguments, and cross-examinations, the judge delivered the final ruling. The courtroom fell into a hushed stillness as she addressed Albert and Rebecca directly. "Mr. Blomfield has demonstrated his ability to provide a stable, supportive environment for his children," the judge began. "Given the evidence presented, I am awarding full custody to Mr. Blomfield. Ms. Blomfield will have supervised visitation rights, pending a review in 6 months." Rebecca's face contorted with rage, but she didn't speak, her lawyer's hand resting firmly on her arm as a silent reminder to maintain composure. Albert exhaled, a weight lifting off his chest. It was over, at least for now. The days after the court ruling felt surreal. For the first time in what felt like forever, Albert experienced peace. The house, no longer a battlefield, filled with the joyful laughter of Elton and Lily. The kids adapted quickly to their new routine. Albert made sure to be there for every recital, every soccer game, and every bedtime story. Together, they began to rebuild their lives, filling the days with warmth and stability. Rebecca, however, wasn't ready to let go. She sent cryptic texts and made veiled threats, but Albert refused to engage. One evening, she showed up unannounced at Elton's soccer game. Her presence sent a ripple of unease through the air. Albert approached her calmly. "You're not supposed to be here, Rebecca. This isn't your scheduled visitation." "I just wanted to see my son play," Rebecca replied, her voice dripping with feigned innocence. "This isn't the way to do it," Albert said, his tone firm yet composed. Rebecca shot him a glare but left without causing a scene. Albert documented the incident and shared it with Mark the next day to ensure it was on record. Over time, Rebecca's disruptions became less frequent. Albert turned his attention fully to his kids and his work, building the life he and his children deserved. With each passing month, the chaos of the past faded further into the background. Elton and Lily thrived. Elton joined the school soccer team, making new friends and scoring goals with increasing confidence. Lily discovered a love for art, filling the house with her colorful creations, which Albert proudly displayed on the fridge. For Albert, life became about rediscovering himself beyond the role of a betrayed husband. He picked up running again, a hobby he'd neglected for years, and began experimenting with cooking as a way to bond with the kids. On weekends, they explored parks, museums, and sometimes indulged in lazy movie nights with popcorn and their dog, Max, curled up beside them. Rebecca's supervised visitations were strained but uneventful. When she showed up, the children were polite but distant. Her repeated absences and lack of genuine effort had weakened their connection to her. One day, Mark called Albert with news. "Rebecca has filed to terminate supervised visits. She's asking for unrestricted access to the kids." Albert sighed, the familiar tension returning. "Do we have to go back to court?" "Not necessarily," Mark replied. "We can contest it with the existing evidence, but it's likely the judge will request a review." Albert prepared himself for another round in court, but the fight never came. Rebecca failed to appear at the hearing, leaving the judge no choice but to dismiss her request. It was the last act of her self-destruction. Months later, Rachel reached out to Albert. She had finalized her divorce from Justin and wanted to thank him for his support. "You gave me the courage to fight back," she said over coffee, her gratitude evident. "I don't think I could have done it without you." Albert smiled warmly. "You helped me just as much. I couldn't have done this alone." Their conversation shifted to lighter topics, and for the first time in a long while, Albert felt the spark of possibility. Rachel had become a trusted ally, and though neither was ready to leap into anything romantic, there was an undeniable connection between them. On a crisp autumn morning, Albert stood on the sidelines of Elton's soccer game, cheering as his son scored a goal. Beside him, Lily sat with her sketchpad, capturing the moment with her usual focus. The sunlight filtered through the trees, and for the first time in years, Albert felt that his life was whole. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was his. The scars of Rebecca's betrayal remained, faint but present, reminders of a painful chapter that no longer defined Albert's life. After the game, Elton sprinted toward him, his face glowing with pride. "Did you see that, Dad?" "I sure did," Albert said, ruffling his son's hair. "You were amazing out there." As they headed to the car, Lily slipped her small hand into his. "Can we get ice cream to celebrate?" she asked, her eyes full of hope. Albert laughed. "How can I say no to that?" The ride to their favorite ice cream shop was filled with laughter and playful banter, a stark contrast to the tense silences that had once consumed their home. The warmth and light in the car reminded Albert just how far they had come. Years passed, and Albert found himself standing in the kitchen of a new home, flipping pancakes while Elton, now a teenager, playfully teased his younger sister. Max lay sprawled at Albert's feet, his tail thumping lazily against the floor. The chaos Rebecca had brought into their lives felt like a distant memory, a shadow of a past that no longer haunted them. Every part of their life had been rebuilt, brick by brick, into something stronger. Albert had created a home where Elton and Lily could thrive, filled with love, laughter, and stability. Occasionally, Albert thought about Rebecca, not with bitterness, but with a sense of detached understanding. She was a part of his story, a chapter that had tested him, but one that ultimately made him stronger. As Albert poured syrup over Lily's pancakes, she beamed up at him. "Dad, these are the best pancakes ever." Albert grinned. "That's because they're made with love." Elton rolled his eyes, but couldn't quite hide the smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Life wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was theirs. And for Albert, that was more than enough.